We had popovers almost every Sunday. We had two pans so we could do them. But you have to decide that breakfast is going to be at 8:30 because that's when the popovers are coming out. And the first ones out are not quite done, but they're quite edible.
Welcome to Dear Food. My name is Ashley Cheney and I love food. I love to make food. I love to eat food. I love to talk about making food. If it has to do with food, I am there. See, I actually believe that food has the power to transport us, not just to different places around the world, but also to different places within our memories. Whether it's a food that takes you back to your grandma's kitchen or that awesome crepe you had while visiting Paris, food is the great vehicle of our imagination. So, if you find yourself drooling over pictures of food on Instagram or watching hours of cooking shows, this show is for you. I created this podcast to connect with the emotional side of food and to be immersed in new cultures and dishes, not just through our belly, but most importantly, through our hearts. I am so excited to have you here. Let's dig in. Hey everyone, welcome back. This week, I am so happy to have on the show my own grandfather, Robert Wunderlich. Now, I was really pretty nervous about putting this episode out. I think because it meant I'm sharing my family with you guys. I'm putting, my whole family life on public display. And what if you don't like it? Does that mean you don't like my family? And then I realized that's just not going to happen. I'm just not going to hold back because of being worried about something that's really just so special. It was wonderful to get to spend an hour sitting down and talking with my grandfather. And I loved it because when we started the interview, he was like, how are we going to talk about popovers for an hour? And I knew in the back of my head that, no problem. This is going to go really well. What I didn't expect was to learn even more about my grandfather than I already knew. I thought I knew his life story. But right out of the gate, he blew me away with some stories from his childhood, which I think you all are really going to enjoy, particularly because they bring us into the kitchen of his military upbringing, but starting in the Philippines. And he really blew me away with some stories that he told me about his experience growing up, around the world, in kitchens around the world. He's, of course, from a military family and then was later in the service himself. I always regard my grandfather as the smartest man I've ever known. And he's not particularly one to be overly talkative. He's an engineer, so he's very, straight to the point. What's the information that you need? And my grandma really takes on the role of the the talker of the family. So it was wonderful to have an opportunity to let him open up and to talk about food in this way that I could really learn even more things about him and hear, just this romantic twinge in his voice when he talks about some of the dishes that he's had. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this week's episode with my grandfather, Bob Wunderlich. Grandpa, welcome to probably your first ever podcast. Have you ever heard a podcast before?
No, I haven't.
It's kind of like a radio program show, except that it's digital now. Kind of bringing back the good old days of radio. Who needs TV anymore? So now, for people that don't know you, like I do, because you're my grandpa and I know all about you, can you tell us, first of all, how old are you, Grandpa?
I'm 91.
91. And you've lived in California? No, you moved around quite a bit. Where did you grow up? Where were you born?
I was born in Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, but I left when I was 6 months old because my father was an Army officer. So I grew up all over the United States and the Philippines.
The United States and the Philippines. Yeah, that's right. There's a picture in your office of you. I think it's in the Philippines. You've got what looks like kind of like a jungle explorer helmet on.
I was about 7 years old and I was standing on the rock on the Bam Bam River.
Is that in the Philippines? Bam Bam River?
Yeah, it's in Luzon. It was about a mile and a half from where I lived.
I start every episode asking our guests what's called the first taste. So I asked you ahead of time, but do you remember the very first food you ever tasted, as a child?
The only one I can remember 85 years ago was when we lived in the Philippines. We had a Chinese cook. He liked me. And so for lunch, he would cook up a mess of rice and hash off the stove and onto my plate, and I loved it.
Oh,
and I can taste it even to today.
Oh, yeah. So you were stationed in the Philippines. You had someone that lived in your home with you, or this was on the base?
We lived on an army post, Fort Stotzenburg, and pretty luxurious. The only servant who lived in was the cook. And the cook relationship back there was sort of strange. He had a room off the kitchen, but we had two house boys, a lavandero, that's a laundry woman, and a yard boy who took care of the yard, but his main job was to watch me, that I didn't get in trouble, that if I didn't wander off, because the jungle was just a few hundred yards away. Like standing in that river was only about a mile away. So I'd go adventuring off and he'd follow me and bring me back. But they didn't live there. They came in the day, went home at night. Only the cook stayed overnight. So he was a very good cook, as I remember, and put on some really nice dinner parties.
So you remember that dish, the rice and hash. Did you ever watch him cook in the kitchen, or did he ever like show you some ways?
Oh, a little bit. Yeah, I watched. I'd watch him make the hash and rice. It's just corned beef, hash and rice. You can make it out of a can now, but he chopped it up and made his own. That's the first thing that stuck in my memory. Obviously, I was about 6, 7 years old. Obviously, I'd been eating before, but I have no memory of any particular meal. That's the first thing I remember. Because I get party because he cooked it up for me, and I could stand and watch him. I was the only one allowed in the kitchen. My mother was not allowed in the kitchen.
What? Why?
It belonged to the cook.
Oh, get out of the cook's kitchen. That's what I thought. So you really only in those early years, that you mentioned that your dad cooked, but that must have been when you were back home.
Yeah, that's when we were back in the States. Yeah. We were stationed at Fort Sill during the war, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. My dad was stationed there, and we lived on base. But my dad was raised by a single mother and with 7 kids. So the kids all learned something about housekeeping. So there was nothing demeaning in his eyes about helping his mother cook or clean house or wash dishes. All the kids were doing it. It didn't seem unusual to him.
Yeah.
He was not the outstanding cook, but he could cook the basics. So I sort of learned from him that it's okay to be a cook.
Yeah. Well, because honestly, even your generation, it was so typical that men weren't in the kitchen, that women were in the kitchen. And then for your dad even to be the one teaching you, I was not expecting to hear that your dad was in the kitchen.
Well, my dad, sometimes we had a maid, sometimes we didn't. My mother did probably most of the cooking. But my dad, for instance, if we were having a steak dinner, my dad would want to cook the steaks.
Yeah.
He saw nothing wrong with helping his wife in the kitchen, put it that way.
Good husband.
Because he was raised by a single mother back in the 1890s.
Wow.
My grandmother was quite a woman too. She remembered the Civil War.
Wow.
She wasn't in the war. She remembered the soldiers going off and coming back and so forth. She told me about it. The kids never knew. She would never admit to any of her children how old she was.
Well, okay, let's keep moving then, because of course what we're here today to talk about is popovers. And so, Grandpa, what are popovers?
My wife and I, we trade cooking. Certain dishes that I cook, certain dishes she cooks. Sunday breakfast I cook, which is always either a popovers or an omelet. Anyway, there's a basic recipe of eggs, salt, flour, and milk that you make Yorkshire pudding out of it. You can make pancakes out of it. You can make waffles out of it. But the only difference, how you're going to use it, probably has to do with the consistency, how liquid it is, how stiff it is. Otherwise, it's the exact same recipe. And popovers are a deep pan, like a muffin tin, except the individual ones are deeper, inch and a half deep maybe. And you make up this batter, it's rather thin, like about cream, put it in there, and put it in a very hot oven, 475-degree oven. This causes the liquid in it to expand. It expands and it becomes sort of hollow inside and all crushed on the outside. That's why it's called a popover. I don't know of any other equivalent because they double in size. When you put them in the pan, they barely fill the pan. When they're done, they're half out of the pan, just in a big balloon-like thing, all from intense heat and the liquid.
The steam.
And you show them out, so really, they're very crusty. Your boyfriend likes the crust.
He does. He's talking about my boyfriend. When we go and visit my grandparents, we special request my grandpa's popovers because they're legendary and they're so delicious. And though I have tried to recreate them with some degree of success, they're never quite the same. But so just to really quickly give you guys a visual, a popover almost looks like a giant muffin. If you've never had either a Yorkshire pudding or a popover or a Dutch baby, even that's kind of similar in the same vein. It's like a crusty, almost like a muffin, but it's very plain. It's very plain, really. I think of it as like a vessel for butter or for jam. But it's like this airy kind of pastry that you open up.
Mostly the crust, depending on how thick it is and the temperature and everything. There might be a little left inside, which you like, Ashley, but mostly it just expands the crust.
Right.
So you eat nice, crisp, tasty.
Yeah, they're hard to describe. It's like an eggy, doughy, airy, crusty thing. And yeah, on the inside, there's like a kind of a gooey crust that you and grandma both scoop out, but I like to eat that part. It's more doughy.
Yeah, well, it's like on the inside is like Yorkshire pudding. It's cooked. It's just it's
Yeah.
soft.
I like this. I like it all. I like to scoop out the soft middle part, put a little bit of butter on that, eat that, and then I like to take the crispy outer part and put jam on that. So I get both the butter and the jam. It ends up not being a low calorie breakfast for me, but it's delish.
There's two secrets I think to them. Is one that you get the right consistency.
Of the batter.
If it's too thick, it freezes before it can. It gets too thick before it can expand all the way. If you make it too thin, it breaks. It opens up. Can't trap the steam. And you, like I said, get the cream. And the other one is get a good pan. I used to have two of them, but when I got divorced, I think my wife took one of them, and because I've only got one. But these were pans my mother bought back in 1934-5. Back then, they made the aircraft industry had began to use aluminum for aircraft, so that allowed them to develop alloys for aluminum. And you've seen the pan.
Yeah. Oh, I've seen the pan. Yeah.
And they made pans and spoons. They called it duraluminum. So it's thick and heavy like an iron pan, except it's not as heavy. And so I've don't know how to make a popover without this really seasoned pan. Nothing sticks.
Yeah.
The popover it come out. If you start with a raw pan and put the dough in, it's going to stick. And so you have to. It's like an old iron frying pan. You have to get it seasoned. But these are light aluminum pans, and I wouldn't know how to make a popover without the pan.
Yeah, I've got a popover pan that I bought just from Bed Bath and Beyond, just to try and recreate your popovers, which again I've said they're nowhere near the same. But the pan that you're talking about is like you can see the history on this pan. I mean, it's basically black, I think, right? I don't think it was black when you got it, but that's I guess the seasoning.
No, it was aluminum looking when my mother got it. I can see from here the popover pan sitting by the sink.
Yeah, I know that pan, and it's if you're watching this video like on YouTube, for example, then you'll be able to see maybe in a minute how black it is. But if you're listening to us, it's like it almost looks like a cast iron pan, and it looks similar to a muffin pan, but it's much deeper than a regular muffin pan.
You could use a regular. If you could find a deep cast iron muffin pan, that would be a popover pan.
The one that I have is it just is very, very deep. It's not cast iron. I don't even know what the material is. But anyway, we've tried to, modify it, make it our own. And they're good, but there's something about Grandpa's famous popovers that are unmatched.
Well, I got this pan already seasoned because my mother made popovers. And so she'd been cooking with them for 20 years when I got a pan. When I inherited the two pans.
How come you inherited the pans? Why'd they go to you?
I don't know why, but they went to me, and I got a spoon, an aluminum spoon. You've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
That my oldest daughter covets.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful material to make things out of, and I don't know why they quit making it.
Yeah, I wish they would still make them out of that material because I really like it. It's light.
It cooks like cast iron, but it's much lighter.
Yeah, exactly. Those cast irons are a bear. Who taught you how to make popovers?
I don't know. My mother made them. I guess I watched her make them. Also, you can look in Fanny Farmer. I think that's where I watched my mother make them, but I couldn't remember exactly. I think I looked in Fanny Farmer.
Yeah.
It's just a simple, ordinary recipe that you can find almost anywhere. There's egg, flour, butter, milk mixture.
It's a simple recipe, but two things. One, a lot of people don't know about popovers or don't even know what they are.
Yeah, you have to know what you're trying to make.
And then the other thing is you had to have had them. So, I love that your mom made them for you. I didn't have my first popover until I was at least 18. I'd never even heard of popovers till I moved out to California with you and grandma. So now it's legendary. And, you can't find them in restaurants. Restaurants rarely serve them because you have to serve them right out of the oven.
Okay, here's a Popover pan.
Oh, yeah.
See how deep it is?
Mm-hmm. So what we're looking at, if for the people that are listening and can't see us, is just basically what looks like a muffin tin. It's got 12 holes, I think.
But it's wider at the top than a muffin, and then it narrows down.
It flares so that you get the Popover out of it. Just narrow at the bottom, so it's tapered, so the pop come out.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I know people would say to me, "Oh yes, I know popovers," but they wanted something that was twisted on itself. It's just a whole different.
A lot of people were just eating Yorkshire pudding from a muffin tin and didn't know the difference.
Right, exactly. And there's an art and a craft to it. So, okay, you had them growing up. Your mom sort of made them, and then Fanny Farmer. Wow, that's a cookbook. That's like classic cookbook. I don't think I actually have ever seen it.
I remember my mother's cookbook. I went out and bought one. That saved my bacon. I didn't know how to make a pot roast, for instance.
So you went out and got a Fanny Farmer cookbook?
I think that's a wonderful basic cookbook. We still look at it.
Saved your skin at Stanford, and it'll keep on delivering. But what I love about hearing about your stories from Stanford, you had a really sort of special role in my heart at Stanford, which was that you were in a fraternity. I think it was a fraternity, right? It wasn't a fraternity?
It was not in a fraternity.
It was
a bunch of students had started a house down in Palo Alto, and as some graduated, they took new students in. So it's sort of rotating free student-run house that had about 16 to 19 students in it.
Okay, so not technically like a Greek organization, but it was a house of other Stanford students.
But yeah, the dependents, most of them were graduate students, and one of them I remember had a younger brother. I had my younger brother John came and went to Palo Alto High School there for a year.
Oh my God!
And lived with me.
I didn't know that.
And my older brother, my younger brother, and myself all went to the same military school, and we went to the same civil engineering at Stanford.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. What I remember from your Stanford stories is that you became sort of the house, the word isn't cook, what would you call it? But you prepared the meals for like 16 to 18 guys at a time.
I would call it cook.
Cook.
I had no idea, but I was on the GI Bill, and if I applied my GI Bill to living, I think we charged $190 a quarter then. I wouldn't have any money. So I found out if I worked as a cook, I could live there for free. All I had to do was feed 16 to 19 people. Actually, I had to just provide the food for everybody, buy it, purchasing. I managed the food intake, and actually breakfast and lunch, the individual students cooked their own. I just had to make sure that food was there for them. I made up pancake batter every day, and the only meal I had to actually cook was dinner.
Wow. And so there, I have to stop because there's like three things that you just said that are actually pretty extraordinary. So tuition at Stanford when you attended was $190 per quarter?
Well, if you lived on campus, it was $225, room and board.
Mm-hmm.
If you lived in this house, we did it for $190 a quarter.
Wow. Okay. And then so the housemates, let's say like the 16 or so people that lived in the house, did they give you money towards the food? Like everybody kind of pitched in?
No, we had an organization. We had a student manager who they paid him. He managed the business side of it. All I was concerned with was the food side.
Okay.
Like I went down every quarter to a wholesale place and would buy cases of canned vegetables and that kind of thing. So I basically stock up the food, 80% of the food at the beginning of each quarter. Then I'd arrange for butter and eggs and milk to be delivered.
Yeah. Well, how did you know how to do that? Like, how did you get so comfortable in the kitchen to prepare that much food for everybody? Because I'll be honest, I think that a lot of college kids of any age, particularly college boys, don't really know how to cook for themselves. So how did you know how to cook for not just yourself, but, 16 to 18 people?
Well, first of all, I learned it because I was stupid. I didn't know anything. My father cooked, so I was sort of familiar with cooking. And I could boil an egg and a steak and bake a potato and those kind of basic things. But how to cook for 16 people and organize the 10 meals and everything, I had no idea. I just sort of jumped in and I kept ahead of being fired, by one meal at a time. Well, I got it under control. But we ate pretty well.
Did you have did the housemates have a favorite food of yours that you prepared?
I don't recall a favorite. One of the things I learned is plan a menu. You can't do it weekly because if every Thursday they get the same thing, they catch on and that upsets them. They want more variety. So I had a 2-week menu. So every 2 weeks I repeated it, but that was far enough that they sort of forgot it. So therefore I knew what to buy, for 3 months in advance. And then I learned to cook 14 meals,
Yeah.
14 different meals. But the one they liked, I think the best was after football games, we held open house. I would make a big pot of spaghetti and we'd buy some loaves of French bread. And one of the students had a contact up at Sonoma somehow of an abandoned winery. It wouldn't abandoned, it had gone out of business. So he could get wine for $1 a gallon or something. So he'd come down and we just held open house for whoever wanted to come in after the football game. We were within walking distance of the football stadium. But they'd come down and we'd party with everybody. That was probably the favorite meal, but only during the football season. I don't recall any other smashing meal I was preparing.
Spaghetti's a good one because you can prepare, it's easy to make. You can make a lot of it for cheap. And then, pair it with some very literal jug wine and you're set. That sounds like
That was just a party meal during football season.
I see.
And so we'd have a lot of outside people come down, particularly the track girls would come down to join the thing. This was an all-male house, unfortunately. We weren't very advanced in those days, but we had a lot of the women that had gone to the football game with a date or without would come down, and because you couldn't drink on campus. There were no bars in Palo Alto and not many restaurants because they couldn't. Way back when Stanford was founded, Leland Stanford was the governor. I'm not quite sure how it happened, but liquor could not be served within a mile of the campus.
I did not know that.
Mostly, so all the restaurants and the bars and everything were not in Palo Alto at that time. So if you wanted to walk from the football stadium to a place of libation, you came to our place.
Hey, must have been a very popular spot indeed. Yeah. Did your kids like popovers growing up? Was that a special Sunday?
Oh, yeah. We had popovers almost every Sunday. We had 2 pans so we could do them. But you're right about them. You have to decide that breakfast is going to be at 8:30 because that's when the popovers are coming out. And the first ones out are not quite done, but they're quite edible, but it's softer. And the last ones out are getting pretty hard and crusty. They're only good over maybe 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a souffle. It's like the timed, the iris that only blooms at midnight on the third Sunday. You have to be ready for the perfect popover. And in this case, being the middle child works in your favor because you get the best the best popover for the ones that are in the middle of the, not the first to come out of the oven, not the last to come out of the oven. The middle ones they're all good to me, but I like the ones that come out in the second wave of out of the oven. Do any of your kids, and then, so for the listeners who don't know my grandpa, as we're learning about him right now, you have 4 kids of your own, and then you married my grandma, who has 4 kids of her own. Do any of those kids ever come to you for recipes or cooking, family recipes?
They learned everything I knew, and they had their own fanny farmer, and they varied cook. Kaki's a good cook. She got sort of interested in it, and she got into the gourmet cooking style. Roast goose and those kind of things. My youngest son, Rob, likes to cook. He's a good cook.
As I'm talking with you, I'm realizing how sort of lucky I am, or just different it is that, in my family too, my direct family, my dad, I grew up with really my dad, but even when he remarried my stepmom, she couldn't cook for anything. God bless her, but she can't cook. So I've mostly grown up around the men being the cooks in really in my life. That's pretty normal for me too. When you married Bev, your first wife, did she do cooking? Was she in the kitchen?
She learned to be in the kitchen.
Yeah.
I don't think she was particularly skilled at, but in that generation, none of the wives worked, and that's sort of the way it was. There's a couple of things I always did right from the beginning. I stuffed the turkey. That's something I learned from my father.
Oh yeah, your stuffing's really good. What's your secret for the stuffing for the turkey?
Well, you use good dried bread, well dried, and you can't toast it in the oven and get it dead. You have to late enough to that. We always added some cornbread to it, and sausage, and onions, sage, poultry seasoning.
Yeah. I think you kind of hinted at one of the biggest secrets that I remember just from living with you is the bread, putting out the bread. I remember you having a brown paper bag of bread that would sit out on the counter for a couple of days before you would start making the stuffing.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I could leave it out without the bag for 2 or 3 days, then put it in the bag for another week or two. You want it naturally dried. You can't toast it and get the same thing. But I learned to make that from my father. And I think he must have learned it from his mother because that was always a family affair. And I would go out and watch Dad stuff the turkey. So I knew how to stuff a turkey by the time I was 10 years old.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. It seems to be a thing. I don't know why, but for some reason, meat in the kitchen is very intimidating to me. So I see this across a lot of kitchens, but for example, me and Drew, I will pretty much cook I really do run the kitchen. I cook a lot. I love being in the kitchen. Obviously, food is my biggest love. But when it comes to meat, I am intimidated. So I always make him do the meat, whether it's turkey, whether it's grilling, whether it's steak. He does the meat for everything. And I think that, I don't know, I just feel like that's a common division of labor between households. But speaking of division of labor, you said that you and my grandma, kind of take turns cooking different things. Would you say that grandma has some specialties and that you have some specialties?
Yeah. Well, what happens is, and this is something I learned when I cooked. Cooking, the actual cooking is the easiest part of it. It's planning what to cook, getting time to get out, get it, make sure you've got everything you need to make the recipe, and you get it all assembled. And then the cooking is the easiest. Moira does almost all the hard work of that kind of thing. That's keeping sure there's flour in the flour basket. And then there's certain meals that I cook, and it depends what she decides what's going to be for dinner. And
Usually.
and if it's fideo or kung pao chicken or meatloaf, I automatically I'm the one who cooks it. She does all the hard work of making sure we've got all the ingredients and everything. And that's really the hard part. And I just sort of got and do my chef thing, and
The dishes too, though. I'll contend that the dishes are the next hard part. That's the worst.
where our kitchen is, fortunately, there's no room for two people to do dishes. So since she's there, I just don't want to interfere with her, and let her detract from the pleasure of doing the dishes. But one thing I do, all frying pans and skillets and everything, I clean up.
That's very considerate of you. Well, Grandpa, before we leave for the day, we'd like to ask every guest if you could have anything in the world for dinner from any time or any place in the world, what would you have for dinner tonight?
That's a tough one to answer because some of the best ones I've had, I don't know exactly what made them so great, but I enjoyed them. One I remember I got when I was in London on the South Bank. It was a French style saucy mushroom dish that I can't describe. It was so delicious, but it just made you float away. In fact, we were there, and a couple of days later, another couple joined us, and I insisted we go back to that restaurant, and I ate it again. Then I had something similar to it in southern France.
Yeah.
So I would say a really good French dish with just a touch of Provence or northern Italy. The really good ones are so perfect, you can't almost describe them. You can't say, oh, it had this, this, and this, and this. Everything just sort of blends together beautifully.
Ooh, yeah. Some kind of French dish in the south of France. That works for me too. Perfect dream dinner.
One thing you mentioned way early in the program, how much things have changed from when I was in school. When I went to Stanford, tuition for the whole year was $500.
Oh, man. Yeah, that's a pretty big change. But I mean, also, if tuition was $500, what was standard minimum wage? We had to have been, I don't even know, but
I have no idea.
well, I'm just so proud to have a grandpa like you for so many reasons. And I just think you're the coolest. And I think you're the best chef. And well, what's the one piece of advice you have for young cooks out there who are just getting started, maybe in the kitchen? You know what? Or even just life advice. You've lived 91 years. You got any advice for any of our listeners?
Marry a good woman.
That's it. That's perfect. That's the best advice you could ever give. Bye, Grandpa. Thank you. This was perfect.
Bye now.
All right, everyone, that's our show for the week. I hope you enjoyed getting to know my family just a little bit better. I sure love them. I hope you do too. Don't forget, if you want to hear your voice on the show, we didn't have any call-ins this week, but if you want to hear your own voice on the show, I love getting messages from you guys, so you feel free to either write in or call in. Quick reminder, if you want to call in, that number is 626-709-6551. That's the Dear Food hotline. You can leave us your stories of your first food that you remember tasting, or just a food that you love. Any questions you might have for us, we want to hear it all right there. Or, of course, you can email us at dearfoodpodcast@gmail.com. Those messages truly, truly, truly make my day, so please write or call in. And lastly, make sure you're subscribed, yeah? So subscribe to us for free on Apple Podcast, and make sure you share this episode or this whole show with a friend who loves food just as much as we do. And start to get excited right now about next week's episode. I can't tell you exactly who, but I can tell you that our guest is from the Food Network. Get excited, y'all. We'll see you right back here next week.